started to do the videos for a while now. One of the most viewed videos in my channel was a video about the Ukrainian war. I think that I'm qualified to talk about this issue because I spent 10 years in Ukraine. I studied there. I did my PhD in political sciences and I speak language. I consider Ukraine as my second homeland because almost all my youth was spent there. In this video, we're going to talk about what was the reason of the war, who is a head of the Wagner, Prigozhin was.
Wagner are mercenaries for hire. They massacre and rape civilians.
How he got that influence, my predictions regarding the war, and what outcomes will war give to the world, which is already being shown in economies all around the world. Talking about the war, it's really important to understand why it started in the first place. As you probably already know, the majority of Ukraine already spoke Russian. Ukraine was a part of Soviet Union, but even before that, Ukraine is considered a historical motherland of current Russia. First Russian state was created in Ukraine. I know it's a little confusing, especially considering that those two countries are in the war right now. Generally speaking, it's really close cultures, say like Canada and United States, for instance. And war between those countries was unimaginable. Like, if you are familiar with the culture, if you know those countries, if you know people from those countries, it's like imagining that Canada will have war with the United States once. But there were different reasons, mostly political. As opposed to Russia, Ukraine had two revolutions during their recent history. First one, I was present there. The first one was called Orange Revolution, where the government was overthrown, and the second was recently the revolution headed by the government elected president Poroshenko.
Launch an appeal to the international community for their support as the Russian troops surround.
And Russia had major business influence in Ukraine. If you would go to the Belarus right now, almost all major economic productions are owned by Russia. Same as in most other post-Soviet states. Very few states, like say Kazakhstan, were able not to sell their major economic players to Russia because they had resources like oil and gas, but most of the countries were owned by Russia economic-wise. Similar thing happened in Ukraine, but after the first revolution, Ukrainian politicians started to sell their major players to the Western companies. For instance, there's a company called Krivorushstal. It's one of the biggest producers in the world. I believe it's the sixth biggest steel producer in the world, and that company is in eastern Ukraine. It was sold by Prime Minister at the time, Tymoshenko. They had an auction, and the company was sold to the Mittal Steel. Mittal Steel was obviously the company headed by Lakshmi Mittal, but the headquarters are in UK. It's mostly UK company, and one of the biggest steel producers in the world. Obviously, this was something that Russian investors would not tolerate, because obviously they invested very heavily in the economy of Ukraine. And after especially the second revolution, this wasn't something that Russia would tolerate. Also, there is a factor that eastern Ukraine is really heavily influenced by Russian people, Russian culture. Most of the guys there, they even consider themselves Russians. Using that factor and pretty much being corrupt in the midst of the day, Russia decided to start some operations in eastern Ukraine back in 2014. And in my opinion, the biggest mistake that Western countries did, they pretty much ignored that. Because before that, Russia had similar operations in Georgia, pretty much seizing the part of the country which is under Russia till now, and it was a sign of being weak of the Russian government. So they decided we can just go take the land and no one would tell nothing to us. Of course, there were some minor sanctions, but nothing major was done. I have friends on both sides. I have Russian friends, I have Ukrainian friends. The weird part is, people understand that it's the governments that are in war. Like, they don't blame each other most of the time. Of course, there are some people that blame any nation. You can find them everywhere. But mostly people understand that it was a political thing, it was a government thing, it had nothing to do with ordinary people. I'm being asked this very often, whose guilt is this? I don't think that it's so easy to make a conclusion on this question, because it can be considered both. Of course, most of the time it's obvious whichever side is attacking you, that part has a guilt. If you would go to the Russian side, you will see many, I don't know which of them are fake, which of them are not, arguments stating that, we were just defending. But of course, in general, I think that it was the Russian party that attacked Ukraine. Ukraine is defending their own land. Of course, Russian government is the ones to take the blame. But generally speaking, you cannot just see Russian people everywhere and blame them. Most of the Russian guys, especially the one who are immigrating, leaving the country, they're against the war. That's the number one reason that they're leaving the country. So it's just a unfortunate situation to be in. Another thing that I need to mention, that seeing the several wars happening during my lifetime, I can definitely say that there are no winners in any war. Every side is losing their youth, every side is giving sacrifices. Definitely, if you would go and ask any person who was in the war, they will say that that's the last resort. That's they would do everything not to have war. There was back in